The Measure of Quiet Water, Episode 6. Lessons at Three-Lip Divide. By the time Amara Day reached the Three-Lip Divide, the morning sun had warmed the top of the divider stone, but not yet the narrow channels beneath it. She rested one palm on the broad, pale slab and felt the difference: warmth above, night coolness lingering along the waterline. The divide stood at the upper edge of the village gardens, where one clear run from the upper measure met a stone nose and separated into three branches. East went toward the terraces. Center wound between kitchen plots and the dye beds. West curved down toward Mint Bend before serving the lower gardens. Each branch began beneath a lip cut into the same old block. When the allocation was right, the lips gave the water three distinct notes that held a quiet relation to one another. This morning, the relation was almost right. Almost was the reason they had come. Nico Sai arrived first, carrying a shallow basket against his hip. Three glazed bowls sat inside it, nested in folded cloth so their rims would not knock together. He had chosen bowls of the same size as Amara had asked. The one was blue, one amber, and one the mottled green of a duck's egg. I tested them from the same measured jug, he said. Filled to the line, they hold the same. And emptied? Amara asked. Nico smiled. Also the same. Useful quality in a bowl. He set the basket on the flat bank. Behind him came Leela then with a roll of brushes wrapped in canvas, and Aaron Vale carrying a small kettle, 4 cups, and a bundle of mint tied with grass. Aaron lifted the kettle as if it explained his presence better than any greeting could. For after, he said. Then we had better do something worthy of tea, Leela replied. Amara had brought her survey satchel. Its strap had shaped itself over years to the curve of her shoulder. Inside were a folding gauge, chalk, string, a thin brass probe, clean cloths, a stub of wax pencil, and the shared survey cards held between 2 cedar boards. She set the satchel beside Nico's basket, but did not open it. Instead, she took 3 pebbles from her pocket and laid them on the sun-warmed stone. She had chosen them from the same gravel shelf below the upper measure. Each was flat enough to sit without rolling. One bore a single white line, one 2 lines, and one 3. East, center, west, Aaron asked. Not yet, Amara said. She placed the 3 bowls along the bank, one near each outgoing channel. Then she moved the pebbles into a row above them. The white marks caught the sun. Nico crouched at the divider. You said this was a routine rebalance. It is. So nothing is wrong? Routine wear can make something wrong by a little. We are here before a little becomes enough to trouble a garden. Leela shaded her eyes and looked upstream. The feed from the upper measure came cleanly around the last bend. Its surface carried thin flashes of sky, broken now and then by the shadow of an alder leaf. No twig mat pressed against the intake. No mud plume drifted from the bank. And we're certain it is the divide? We aren't certain of anything yet, Amara said. The gardeners at Mint Bend noticed their morning line arriving later than it did a month ago. The terrace keepers have noticed no excess. The center beds look ordinary. That is enough reason to compare, not enough reason to decide. She watched them look toward her satchel. They knew the gauge was there. On other mornings, she would already have unfolded it, seated its feet against the measuring notches, and given them 3 numbers. Numbers were comforting. They seemed to arrive without opinion, but a gauge answered only the question it had been made to answer, and Amara wanted the 3 of them to learn the questions that came before it. She sat on her heels beside the stone. Today the rebalance is a shared lesson, she said. I will show you every check I would make. Before that, you will show me what you already know. Aaron looked mildly alarmed. I know how to make tea. You know more water than that. Tea has been my most successful use of it. Then listen as if the divide were a kettle. The west branch slipped under its lip with a low, damp whisper. The center struck a shallow seam in the channel floor and made a quick, hollow tapping. East poured over a smoother drop, its note thinner but continuous. Together the sounds occupied the stone hollow like three people humming in neighboring rooms. Amara placed one finger against her lips. They listened. At first Nico's attention moved visibly. His eyes followed flecks of foam. Leela leaned closer to the western opening, then drew back to hear all three at once. Aaron closed his eyes. Leaf shadows passed over their hands and over the three marked pebbles. The upper measure pressed on behind the divider with a steady hush. Rookie Luke. S4E06H1 start. Three people listened to the same divider and reported three different things. The west note breaks, Aaron said. Not often. It holds low, then catches as if the kettle were just short of boiling. The center depth is steady against the second chisel mark, Leela said. East is a finger's width below its moss stain. West is harder to see, but its surface trembles under the lip. Nico pointed to three alder leaves that had entered the branches together. The center leaf reached that pale stone first. East is close. West is still turning in the first pool. They were learning to compare the village's three main water branches, and none of the observations sounded alike. Amara did not correct them. She opened her satchel, seated the folding gauge across the lip notches, and waited for its three floats to settle. Sound says the west flow catches, she said. Depth says the branches are near their familiar levels, with a small uncertainty at west. Leap speed says west is carrying less energy past the first pool. My gauge says the western share is low by a narrow measure. She folded the gauge again. Different readings. One diagnosis. Ick. S4E06HE1END. Nico looked pleased, then thoughtful. If you had used the gauge first, we might only have known the number. We would have known what the gauge did, Amara said. We would not yet know whether the branch agreed. Leela put her fingertips against the stone just above the west lip. And the broken note might tell us where to look. Perhaps. Or it might tell us only that we need to look. Amara assigned the pebbles at last. One white line belonged to east, two to center, three to west. She asked each person to turn one over in a palm, feel its edges, and replace it. The markers were not labels for the people. They belonged to the branches and would move between hands as the work proceeded. Why pebbles? Nico asked. Because wet paper tears. Chalk washes away, and memory enjoys improving a result after the fact. Pebbles don't. Pebbles are very poor storytellers. Aaron picked up the three-line stone. This one says it would like to visit Mint Bend. Later it will. They began with the bowls. Amara showed them how to rinse each twice in branch water so a dry bowl did not steal the first drops. They agreed on a count. Aaron would tap a wooden spoon against his palm 20 times slowly and evenly, while the others held the bowls beneath the lips. They would rotate the bowls and repeat, removing any difference among the vessels from the comparison. On the first run, center collected most, east a little less, west least. On the second, the colors changed places, but the order did not. On the third, a gust rattled the alder and Aaron lost his beat when a leaf landed on his nose. They discarded that run without debate. A result can be charming and useless, Leela said. Aaron removed the leaf. I thought it had great character. The next run held. Amara asked Nico to arrange the bowls from fullest to least full without naming the branches. He did. She asked Leela whether the difference between east and center would concern her. Leela studied the meniscus against a thread stretched between two twigs. Not alone, she said. Their downstream needs aren't identical and the difference is slight. West? Enough to investigate because Mint Bend already reported lateness. Amara turned to Aaron. What would make you stop the whole flow? He glanced upstream, then beneath the lips. A crack changing under pressure. A stone loose enough to drop. Something wedged where a hand can't safely reach while water runs. Do you see any of those? No. Then we keep the branches watered while we learn. This was the ordinary grace of maintenance, Amara thought, not the dramatic closing of a gate. Not villagers waiting with dry ditches while an expert fought the system, but 4 people kneeling in sun and shade while water continued on its useful way. The divide had worked through spring grit and early summer growth. It asked now for attention, not rescue. She finally handed out tasks. Each of them would follow one branch far enough to see how the share behaved beyond the first turns. They would observe 3 things: sound at a known stone, depth at a fixed mark, and the response of a garden or planted bank. Amara would remain at the divide for the first interval, watching the source and checking whether the incoming flow changed while they were gone. No adjusting anything downstream, she said. Lift no little gates. Pull no weeds unless they are floating free and you can remove them without changing the channel. We're reading before we write. Nico took east and the 1-line pebble. Leela took center and the 2-line pebble. Aaron received west and tucked the 3-line pebble into the smallest pocket of his vest. What if the garden response disagrees with the depth? Nico asked. Bring back both. What if I don't know what a sound means? Aaron asked. Bring back the sound. Leela lifted her chin toward the unopened roll of brushes. What if I find the answer? Bring it back without fixing it. She gave Amara a look that admitted this would be the hardest instruction. They set off. For a few moments their footsteps traveled together along the bank. Then Nico crossed the narrow plank toward the terraces. Leela followed the center run between low stone borders, and Aaron walked west beneath the mint and alder. Their colored sleeves appeared and vanished behind leaves. Amara stayed beside the 3 empty bowls. The divide sounded larger without their voices. She set the gauge once more, recorded the 3 positions on a scrap slate, and lifted it away. Then she listened as Aaron had listened. The west note held low, caught, and resumed. She looked as Leela had looked. The surface under the western lip trembled, though the downstream depth did not collapse. Finally she watched an alder leaf choose the west branch and hesitate in the first pool. 3 methods, she thought. Not rivals, neighbors. When the others returned, they placed their marked pebbles on the warm stone before they spoke. Nico reported a clear run at the terrace stair, depth just under the old blue mark, and bean leaves lifted rather than drooping. Leela reported an even murmur at the center footbridge, water touching the lower edge of the carved square, and damp soil at the dye bed inlet. Aaron reported that the west channel grew quieter after the first pool, ran shallow over the copper-colored step, and reached the nearest mint roots without quite filling the familiar side hollow. Amara repeated each report back to them, not smoothing away the differences in language. Nico had measured movement. Leela had measured position. Aaron had measured voice and reach. Together they had collected a picture with more dimensions than her gauge could provide. Now, she said, setting the bowls back into the basket, we make the first full round. For the second inspection, nobody kept the branch first assigned. Amara gave Leela the eastern pebble, Aaron the center, and Nico the west. Changing readers mattered. A person who expected to find a shallow line could persuade every ripple to confirm it. A fresh pair of eyes had fewer promises to keep. Amara walked with them as far as the place where the channels separated beyond sight of one another. The east branch climbed visually, though it descended in fact, tracing the terrace wall toward higher ground. The center branch slipped under a little bridge made from one slab. West widened beneath overhanging mint, curved around a fig tree, and vanished toward Mint Bend. Meet at the pale stepping stone, she said. Take enough time that you stop trying to be quick. Leela turned east. Aaron ducked under the center bridge even though there was room to walk around it. Nico followed the west bank with a 3-line pebble in one hand. Amara chose no branch. She went upstream to the upper measure. The upper measure was a long stone basin fed through a grated throat. It steadied the supply before the water descended to the divide. At its shaded end, 2 lines had been cut into the wall. one for the usual summer morning level, another for the lower allowance used in the hottest weeks. The water stood between them, where it should. Amara cleared 3 needles caught against the grate, laid them on the bank, and watched for a full minute. The level held. This mattered because a changing supply could imitate a faulty division. If the upper measure had been falling during their bowl tests, the last bowl might appear to belong to the weakest branch, simply because it had been filled last. They had rotated the bowls in the order, but no method became worse by knowing its source. At the pale stepping stone, Leela arrived with a sprig of bean blossom she had found on the path, not plucked from a vine. Aaron arrived carrying nothing and looking damp at one knee. Nico came last, his gaze still turned toward the west branch. Upper, measure steady, Amara said. Leela put down the one-line pebble. At the terrace stair, East made a thin singing sound where it crossed a diagonal groove. The depth sat below the blue paint but matched the moss edge. The nearest bean bed showed dark soil along its feeder furrow, while the farthest corner was merely cool. She had pressed one knuckle into the soil beside, not inside the root line. Would you call the branch short? Amara asked. No, I would call it supplied without excess. Aaron placed the 2-line pebble beside hers. Center sounded brisk below the footbridge. Its depth reached the carved square exactly on the upstream face and fell a little below it downstream, as the old card said it should. The madder bed had taken water along both sides. One loose leaf had circled at the inlet. But he had left it because it was not blocking anything. I admired it without interference, he said. Growth, Leela said. Then Nico set down the west pebble. He had listened at the copper-colored step. The branch sounded soft there, with none of Aaron's intermittent catch, because the troublesome note lived closer to the lip. Depth ran a thumb below a dark mineral stripe. At the first mint patch, water reached every root. At the side hollow Aaron had mentioned, only the bottom shone. And I tried something, Nico said. Amara waited. I didn't adjust anything. What did you try? He had chosen 2 fallen leaves of nearly the same size from the damp edge, returned to the first place where west ran close beside center, and released them together. He had marked a downstream line with 2 pebbles already lying on the bank. The center leaf crossed first, the western leaf took longer. But Nico had no count because his own steps were uneven, and he had tried to watch both leaves. Then the method needs a steadier count, Amara said. The idea does not. They returned together to the divide. The sun had moved high enough to brighten the water beneath the east lip. Small wavering nets of light covered the channel floors. Amara let them drink from the jug Aaron had brought for that purpose, not from the kettle reserved for tea. Then Nico searched the bank for another matched pair of leaves. He rejected a curled fig leaf and 2 mint leaves of unequal length. At last, he found 2 narrow alder leaves, both newly fallen and still supple. He laid them side by side on the divider stone. Their stems differed, so Leela pinched each stem off at the same point. That changes them equally enough, she said. Nico chose the neighboring stretches of center and west, just after their first curves. The channels there were similar in width for 6 paces, and each crossed a line of pale mortar. Aaron stood at the mortar line to call the arrivals. Leela crouched where she could see both roots. Amara took the folding gauge from her satchel but kept it closed against her knee. Leacock, S4E06, HDU. Start to. Nico released 2 leaves into neighboring channels at once. The leaves floated flat, one on the center branch and one on the west. Their travel time offered a simple comparison of branch flow. Nico counted aloud. 1 calm number for each tap of Leela's finger against the stone. The test did not measure the whole allocation by itself. It compared 2 similar 6-pace stretches while the supply from the upper measure stayed steady. If 1 leaf snagged or spun, they would repeat the trial. This first pair could show a difference clearly enough to investigate, but it could not command a gate change. The center leaf crossed the pale mortar at 12. Aaron called, "Center." The western leaf turned once in a shallow eddy, straightened, and crossed at 15. Amara opened her gauge at the divide. Its center float held at the ordinary mark. The western float settled a narrow measure lower. "Same answer," Nico said. The slower western leaf had confirmed the same slight imbalance as Amara's gauge. Her brass instrument supplied a scale. His 2 leaves had made the difference visible without one. And Mon. And Mara said. Nico looked surprised. "You believe it." Belief is not the same as a repeat. They found 2 more leaves and switched which one entered which channel, in case one shape traveled more readily. Center again arrived first, this time by 2 counts. A third pair gave nearly 3. Nico placed the spent leaves on the bank above the water so none would drift into a grate farther down. Amara showed him how to note the comparison without pretending it was more precise than it had been. On the slate he wrote, "Center ahead of west by 2 to 3 slow counts over 6 paces. 3 trials." He did not convert counts into a flow volume. The leaves could compare. They could not tell him liters. A method should say what it knows, Amara said, and also where it becomes quiet. They now had evidence that west received slightly less useful movement near the divide. The downstream observations agreed. The incoming supply held steady. The question became where the difference began. Amara asked them to inspect the 3 lips without touching. They lay flat on their stomachs across the warm slab, heads over the downstream face, while she stood ready to catch a belt or ankle if anyone leaned too far. The arrangement made Aaron laugh until a splash struck his cheek. East showed a smooth underside, dark with water and green only at the outer corner. Center had 1 pale streak, where a grain of quartz ran through the stone. West appeared much the same from above. Yet its note caught again. Low, steady. Then briefly rough. Leela shifted until the leaf shadow no longer crossed the opening. "The edge isn't even." "Worn?" Nico asked. "Maybe." Amara passed her a little square of polished metal to use as a mirror. Leela held it below the lip, angling reflected sunlight upward. A pale crust showed for an instant beneath the shadowed edge, then vanished when the mirror trembled. "There," Leela said. "Something light beneath west." Aaron took a turn with the mirror. "I see it, like a tooth." Nico looked and frowned. "I see glare." "Glare is an honest report," Amara told him. She used the brass probe only as a pointer, keeping its tip clear of the flowing slot. A roughened lip can disturb the thin sheet of water. It can also collect scale. Either may narrow the effective opening. We still do not know which came first. Does it matter? Aaron asked. It matters to the correction. If the stone itself has worn into a bad shape, cleaning will not restore it. If scale makes the shape look worn, changing the gate would correct the wrong thing. There was a small upstream shutter that could alter the pressure across all 3 lips, and removable stone slips could narrow an individual opening. Seasonal rebalancing sometimes required resetting one of those slips. Such a change was easy enough to make, and troublesome to undo after gardens had adjusted to it. Amara wanted them to feel the attraction of a decisive action and resisted until the evidence required one. She asked each trainee to state a provisional explanation. Nico thought West was impeded close to the divide because leaf delay appeared immediately and stayed visible downstream. Leela thought a deposit beneath the lip was more likely than structural wear, because the upper edge remained aligned with the other 2. Aaron thought the broken note meant water struck something uneven, but he could not tell whether the unevenness was stone or scale. Mine is that the western lip deserves a dry inspection, Amara said. Notice that mine is not yet an explanation. To inspect beneath it, they did not need to stop all 3 branches. A small maintenance paddle could divert the west share into center for less than a minute, long enough to wipe and look, while Aaron watched the center bank for overtopping. Amara described the maneuver, but did not perform it. "Who calls the beginning?" she asked. "The person at center," Aaron said, "because he knows whether it can accept the extra water." "Who calls the end?" Leela answered. "Either center if the level rises too far, or the inspector when the lip has been seen." "Who moves the paddle?" Nico glanced at Amara's hands. "I can." They rehearsed with the paddle held above water. Aaron took position where the center branch narrowed. Leela knelt downstream of West with a dry cloth ready. Nico set both hands on the paddle grip. Amara stood beside him, close enough to intervene but not touching. Aaron called ready. Nico lowered the paddle into its shallow guide. The west sheet thinned and stopped. Center deepened. Leela wiped once beneath the western lip, looked, and called clear. Nico raised the paddle. Aaron reported that center had stayed within its bank. The interruption had lasted 17 of Leela's steady finger taps. On the cloth lay a faint cream-colored grit. With the water restored, the western notes sounded as before. The quick wipe had removed loose sediment, but not the pale ridge beneath the lip. Leela held up the cloth. Tiny grains flashed against the weave. "Mineral," she said. "Likely," Amara replied. "Now we find out how much of it is attached." They sat back from the edge. Nobody suggested moving the gate. The three bulls waited on the bank, their rinsed interior shining. Nico's leaves rested beside the slate. At the upper measure, the surface remained calm between its marks. The western lip was slightly roughened. Whether the roughness belonged to ancient stone or this season's scale was now a question small enough to answer with their hands. Leela unrolled the canvas bundle. Her brushes lay in stitched pockets, soft fiber, stiff root, narrow reed, and one old toothbrush whose blue handle had faded almost gray. She also carried a flat wooden scraper, a lump of chalk, and a short spool of undid thread. "No metal scraper?" Aaron asked. "Not on a measured edge." Amara nodded. A tool harder than the deposit but softer than the stone reduced the chance of turning maintenance into damage. The brass probe could test a surface, but they would not pry with it. They needed a longer look than the first interruption had allowed. Before diverting west again, Amara sent Nico to check the nearest Mint Bend inlet and tell its keeper that the branch would pause briefly twice. He returned with permission and a message. The keeper had already watered the most sensitive seedlings, and 10 quiet minutes would do no harm. Leela prepared the workplace while he was gone. She spread a folded cloth in the shallow west channel to catch loosened scale, anchoring its upper corners with clean stones outside the main flow. She set the soft brush and wooden scraper within reach. Aaron shifted the three bulls well away from elbows and feet. Amara checked the maintenance paddle's edge for grit. "What softens the scale?" Nico asked when he returned. "Water, patience, and sometimes mild vinegar," Leela said. "We begin with the first two." "Mint tea," Aaron offered. "For the workers, not the stone." They diverted the west share again. This time Aaron counted center's rising depths against a chalk mark Amara placed safely below the bank top. Nico held the paddle. Leela lay across the slab with the mirror in one hand and the soft brush in the other. Without water darkening the underside, the deposit became plain. A cream ridge followed the inner half of the western lip. It was no thicker than 2 stacked leaves at its broadest point, but the sheet of branch water was thin enough for that to matter. At one place the ridge had built around a rough grain in the stone, making the little tooth Aaron had seen. Leela touched it with the soft brush. Powder came away from the outer surface. Beneath, the ridge remained firm. "Scale," she called. "Attached, not stone." "Enough," Amara said. Nico lifted the paddle and west ran again. The caught powder drifted into the cloth instead of downstream. Leela sat up, A damp strand of hair stuck to her forehead and looked satisfied in the quiet manner of someone whose suspicion had accepted examination. The discovery reduced the size of the problem. They did not need to reshape a lip or change a stone slip. They did not need to alter the upstream shutter. They needed to soften a narrow mineral deposit, remove only what had accumulated, and compare the branches again. Amara drew 3 possibilities on the slate: change the gate, dress the stone, clean the scale. She crossed out the first 2. Why not leave them written? Nico asked. So anyone reading the card later knows we considered them, she said. She rewrote the 2 options under a line marked considered, then added not indicated. A crossed-out thought can look like a mistake. This was reasoning. Leela measured the ridge with thread against the mirror's reflection, marking its length between her fingernails. It covered less than half the lip. Aaron listened once more and located the catch at roughly the same place by moving his head slowly along the downstream face. Nico floated a single leaf into west and watched it turn at the first pool. Small thing, he said. Small things are allowed to have consequences. Amara replied. They are not allowed to frighten us into large corrections. They agreed on the minimal adjustment. Leela would hold a cloth soaked in warm water against the deposit during several short diversions. Nico would operate the paddle. Aaron would watch center and keep the timing. Amara would supervise the first cycle and then exchange places so each person understood more than one role. Once softened, they would use only the soft brush. The wooden scraper would remain unused unless the brush failed, and any use of it would begin with a new inspection. Aaron filled the kettle from the clean jug rather than the channel and poured a little heated water into a spare cup. He left the mint bundle tied. For stone, he said solemnly. Leela tested the water with a fingertip. Warm, not hot. The divide approves. Amara looked at the old stone. It had no opinion she could hear, but care often benefited from being spoken aloud. Instructions became easier to remember when attached to a little ceremony. They took shade for a few minutes while the kettle heated another cup. Leaf shadows shifted over the bank. Nico copied the upper measure level onto the slate. Aaron drew 3 little waves beside the branch reports. A thin, unbroken line for east, quick arcs for center, and a low line with 1 notch for west. Leela did not laugh at the notation. That is almost clearer than writing intermittent catch, she said. Almost? Your wave looks like a sleeping caterpillar. A caterpillar can be intermittent. Amara added the symbol to the edge of the slate. A shared record did not require every observer to become the same kind of observer. It required their marks to be understood by the next person. Before work resumed, she asked them separately what success would look like. Nico said the west leaves should travel closer to the center leaves. Leela said the underside should return to a continuous stone edge without gouges or loose scale. Aaron said the west note should hold without catching. Then all 3 added that the bowl volumes and downstream garden checks must agree. And if one does not? Amara asked. We don't call it balanced, Leela said. We find out why, Nico added. Aaron touched the kettle. The tea waits. Their answer pleased Amara, though she kept the pleasure from becoming an instruction. She had spent years being the person whose final look turned uncertainty into permission. The village trusted her because she returned to checks others considered finished. That trust was useful. It could also become a narrow gate through which every judgment had to pass. Today she wanted the evidence to pass among 4 people and arrive whole. The West Branch carried its slightly diminished share toward Mint Bend. Nothing downstream was failing. No leaf wilted while they considered the correction. The scale beneath the lip was ordinary seasonal wear, minerals left behind where thin water met warm air, gathered around one rough grain, slowly changing the edge. It was the kind of fault that rewarded restraint. Leela rolled the unused stiff brush back into its pocket. Soft first, she said. Nico set his palms on the paddle. Aaron moved to the center mark. Amara took the warmed cloth. The group had found the smallest cause that fit every reading, and they had chosen the smallest work that could remove it. The first softening cycle lasted 20 counts. Nico lowered the maintenance paddle only after Aaron called ready from center. Wes thinned to a silver cord and disappeared beneath the lip. Amara folded the warm cloth twice, pressed it against the cream ridge, and held it there while Leela counted. At 18, Aaron warned that center had reached the chalk mark. At 20, Amara removed the cloth, and Nico restored the branch. They waited for center to settle before repeating the cycle. The water carried no hurry, although their work required attention. Each time the paddle descended, center accepted the extra share and rose toward the chalk. Each time it lifted, the 3 branches found their separate courses again. On the 3rd cycle, Amara handed the cloth to Leela and went to watch center. Aaron took the paddle. Nico counted. The change of roles made their calls less polished for a moment. "Ready," Amara said. Aaron lowered too slowly, and the West note descended through several tones instead of stopping cleanly. "That's a haunted door," Nico said. "Count," Leela reminded him from beneath the slab. He counted. At 16, Leela called that the cloth had cooled. At 17, Aaron lifted. Amara checked the center bank and found it safely below the chalk because the gradual diversion had sent less extra flow during the interval. "Was that wrong?" Aaron asked. "It was controlled," Amara said, "but a clean movement gives the person below a more predictable window." On a second attempt, the paddle seated in one smooth motion. Leela held the newly warmed cloth against the ridge for 20 counts and withdrew. When water returned, a pale flake loosened and settled onto the catch cloth downstream. They all saw it. Amara felt the familiar impulse to take the brush, test the deposit, and finish the delicate part herself. The impulse was not distrust exactly. It came from long practice, from knowing in her muscles how a softened ridge felt just before it released, and how quickly a careless bristle could scatter grit. Yet she had brought Leela because Leela understood surfaces. A lesson in shared judgment that reserved every consequential touch for the teacher would teach its own, narrower truth. "What next?" Amara asked. Leela examined the flake in her palm. One more warm cloth. Then soft brush from the outside toward the catch cloth. No scraping. Do it. This time Nico watched center. Amara moved the paddle, and Aaron counted while Leela worked. After the soaking interval, Amara kept the west flow diverted. Leela brought the soft fiber brush under the lip and drew it along the ridge with strokes so short they barely seemed to move. Fine cream dust fell onto the damp cloth. She stopped after 3 strokes. "Inspect," she said. Amara restored the flow. They let the branch rinse itself for half a minute, catching what it carried. The western note still caught, though less sharply. Nico sent an alder leaf through. It did not turn fully in the first pull, but it drifted close to the eddy before moving on. "Better is not finished," he said. "Good," Amara replied. The next inspection showed the outer ridge gone and a firm patch remaining around the rough grain. Leela proposed warming only that patch. Aaron folded a smaller cloth pad. Nico suggested shortening the diversion because the area was smaller. They agreed on 15 counts with a warning at 12. Amara listened to them decide. She asked one question. "What would make you stop brushing?" "If the material underneath changes color," Leela said. "If the brush begins catching on stone. If a piece larger than scale moves." They proceeded. The patch softened. Leela brushed twice and stopped at a darker line. She showed them the underside in the mirror. The cream deposit had vanished. Beneath it lay the original stone, slightly rough where a quartz grain rose from the cut surface, but continuous with the lip. "That grain started the collection," Nico said. Likely, Leela answered. Do we smooth it? Amara did not answer for them. Aren studied the reflected edge. The lip worked before the scale grew, and dressing the grain would remove stone, Leela said. We can't put it back. Nico nodded. Leave it. Note it for the next seasonal check. Amara looked from one face to another. Agreed. They removed the catchcloth carefully, folding grit inward. No deposit went down toward Mint Bend. Aaron poured the dirty rinse into a patch of bare gravel well away from the channel. Leela washed the soft brush over the same place, and Nico returned the anchoring stones to the bank where he had found them. The western lip had needed correction. The other two still needed the routine cleaning for which the seasonal visit allowed. They began with east. Leela set a fresh catchcloth below it, and Aaron watched west while Nico used the maintenance paddle to send east share briefly into the other branches. Amara held a clean damp cloth against the underside for 10 counts. Only loose green film came away from the outer corner. Leela followed with one light pass of the soft brush, then inspected the smooth stone in the mirror. There was no attached ridge and no reason for a second pass. They let all 3 flows settle before cleaning center. This time Leela held the damp cloth, Amara watched the receiving branches, and Aaron moved the paddle at Nico's call. The pale quartz streak remained part of the stone, as their earlier inspection had shown. A thin wash of ordinary silt lifted beside it, under 2 gentle brushstrokes and collected in the cloth. Leela stopped as soon as the original surface showed. No one scraped, dressed, or widened either opening. When center ran again, they rinsed both fresh catchcloths onto the same bare gravel used for the western scale and washed the brush there. East, center, and west had now each received an appropriate seasonal cleaning, light film from east, loose silt from center, and the softened mineral ridge from west. Only west had required corrective work. The 3 stone lips remained unchanged in shape and setting. Now came comparison. They reset the 3 bowls beneath the lips and repeated the timed fills, rotating colors through east, center, and west. The first run showed west closer to the others but still a little low. The center bowl held the most. Aaron drew his 3 wave marks on the slate, putting no notch in west this time. The sound has steadied, he said. But the bowl says, wait. On the second run, east and west were nearly equal, center a little above. On the third, west appeared above east by the width of a fingernail at the rim. Nico frowned. Did we overshoot? Cleaning cannot overshoot unless we removed stone, Leela said. Or unless the bowls and count vary, Amara added. What do we do with close readings? More of them? Aaron said. They changed the filling order and the person holding each bowl. They checked that the bowls sat at the same angle under the thin sheets of water. They stretched the thread level between 2 upright pegs and compared the menisci against it on flat ground. Across 6 valid runs, the order varied by tiny amounts, but no branch remained consistently least. The gross difference that had marked west before cleaning was gone. Nico repeated the leaf trial between center and west. 1 pair reached the mortar line together. In the next, west arrived 1 count ahead. In the third, center arrived 1 count ahead. Within the leaves, he said, their shapes matter more than the branch difference now. Leela examined the 3 familiar depth marks. West had risen to its dark mineral stripe. East held at the moss edge, center touched the second chisel mark. None showed a sudden surge. Aaron moved along the face of the divide, listening with his head turned. East gave its thin, continuous note. Center tapped lightly over the seam. West held low and even. 3 sounds, none identical, none interrupted. Amara unfolded the gauge and placed it within reach. Then she left it there. What does the group read? She asked. Nico looked at the slate. The leaf difference has disappeared within the variation of the leaves, Leela said. All 3 depths have returned to their familiar marks, and the western edge is clean without being reshaped. Aaron said, The 3 notes are steady. West no longer catches. The bowls? Amara asked. They reviewed the 6 runs. Each branch had been highest at least once, and lowest at least once. But the spread remained narrow. There was no consistent deficit. They discussed whether Center's average might still be slightly greater. Leela reminded them that perfect equality at the lips was not necessarily correct allocation, because each downstream channel differed in length, loss, and demand. The old summer settings were designed so the branch marks, not the bowl rims alone, formed the useful balance. Then the bowl test says no lip is being starved, Nico said. The depth marks say the intended shares are restored. Aaron touched the slate beside his unbroken wave. And the sound says the obstruction is gone. Amara waited. She did not reach for the gauge. The pause lengthened until they understood that she was not withholding an answer. She was leaving room for theirs. Leela looked at Nico. Nico looked at Aaron. Aaron gave a small, serious nod. We declare the divide balanced, Leela said. Nico added, pending downstream confirmation. A wise footnote, Aaron said. Amara picked up the gauge at last. Would you like this reading? They did. Trusting their judgment did not require refusing another instrument. She seated its feet in the old notches and let the floats settle. East, center, and west stood within the accepted summer bands recorded on the survey card. The gauge agreed with them. It was the final reading, not the first command, before they prepared for the downstream walk. Amara asked them to perform one last blind comparison. She turned the slate face down and covered the gauge marks with its folded legs. Leela moved the bowls out of their familiar color order. Aaron chose the count. 17 taps this time, and Nico decided who would hold each vessel. Amara would hold west, Leela east, and Nico center. They took their positions without speaking the branch names. Aaron began. The spoon touched his palm with a dry, patient sound. Water rang differently in each bowl as the levels rose. Amber gave a deepening plink, blue answered more brightly, and green muffled the falling sheet. At 17, all 3 holders withdrew together. They placed the bowls on flat stone. Nico turned his back while Leela changed their positions. Then he faced them and studied only the water lines. No meaningful least, he said. Amber may be a breath below blue, but green has a wider glaze line and makes the rim hard to compare. Leela laid the thread across the reference pegs. The apparent difference narrowed further. A bead clung to the inside of amber above the meniscus, making its level look lower from Nico's first angle. Would you keep the run? Amara asked. Yes, with a note that the difference is below a confident reading. Not discard it because it is inconvenient. No. It tells us the bowls cannot separate the branches at this scale. They ran the test again with different hands. This time, green appeared lowest until Aaron noticed that the holder's thumb had shaded the meniscus. In full light, the lines were almost indistinguishable. There is a useful end to an instrument, Leela said. Amara uncovered the gauge. And what happens when one tool reaches it? Another kind of reading carries the question, Aaron replied. They moved downstream only a few paces and read the fixed marks once more. Those marks did not show equal heights. East rested at its moss edge, center at the second chisel, and west at the dark stripe. Their visible differences belonged to different channel shapes. Nico crouched so his eyes were level with each surface instead of comparing from above. If I had aimed for the same depth in all 3, he said, I would have changed at least 2 settings, and perhaps deprived a garden while making the divide look tidy, Leela said. Amara asked them why the old marks deserved confidence. Together they built the answer. The marks had been observed across seasons. Their associated branches had known destinations and needs. Today the gardens gave current evidence, the upper measure gave current supply, and the repeated comparisons showed no persistent shortfall. The marks were not magic cuts. They were compressed memory. Useful because fresh observations unfolded and tested that memory. Aaron drew a line through the chalk warning on the center bank, then stopped. Should we leave it for the next crew? What did it mark? Amara asked. The highest safe level during our temporary diversion. Will it mean that tomorrow? He looked at the drying bank. No. Supply could change. Someone might mistake it for an ordinary depth. He washed the chalk away with a damp cloth and squeezed the cloth onto bare gravel. The permanent chisel mark remained. The temporary working mark vanished when its purpose ended. Nico made a final sketch on the slate showing the 3 paths from the upper measure. His first lines made west shortest because the page edge crowded him. He erased them and began again, drawing only enough of each branch to locate the observation points: terrace stair, center footbridge, copper step, bean furrow, dye bed square, mint bend hollow. A map can lie from lack of room, he said. So can a sentence, Amara replied. Lila labeled the sketch not to scale. Aaron added his sound marks beside the 3 lips. The slate now held numbers, waves, root lines, and short phrases in several hands. It would be copied selectively to the shared card later, but for the moment it showed the full mess of arriving at a clear judgment. Amara had once believed teaching meant arranging knowledge in the order another person ought to receive it. Today, the order had gone the other way. Nico's leaves had made her gauge easier to understand. Lila's surface reading had prevented a needless structural change. Aaron's listening had located the disturbance before anyone saw it. Their methods did not decorate her conclusion, they formed it. She said this aloud. Nico ran a thumb along the edge of the slate. Then what did you teach? To compare before correcting. To know what each observation can and cannot claim. To make the smallest change that fits the evidence. Lila nodded toward the cleaned west lip. And a stop. Especially that. The branch notes continued steadily while they packed the immediate tools. Nothing in their conversation improved the allocation further. That was another kind of proof. They could discuss the work without reaching toward the settings. They rinsed the bowls and set them upside down on a clean cloth. The western lip shone dark beneath the passing sheet. Sun had reached the lower stone now, and warmth rose from the bank around their knees. Crushed mint scented the air where Aaron had stepped near, but not on the planted edge. Amara asked them to reconstruct the work without looking at the slate. They named the reports for Mint Bend, the steady upper measure, the rotated bowl tests, the downstream sound and depth observations, the leaf trials, the dry inspection, the cream ridge, the warm cloth, and the soft brush. They also named what they had not done: no gate change, no dressing of the stone, no prolonged shutdown, no assumption that one measurement told the whole story. And who decided it was balanced? Amara asked. For a moment they were quiet. We did, Nico said. The words settled as naturally as a pebble placed on warm stone. Amara assigned the final check. Each branch would be walked again, farther this time, to a downstream point where its water entered a working garden. The checkers would go separately and return separately. No one would share a conclusion along the way. Each would carry the branch's marked pebble and bring it back only if the allocation worked throughout the run. If it did not, the pebble would remain at the first doubtful place, and the checker would return empty-handed. You aren't taking one? Lila asked. I am staying here. With the gauge? Aaron asked. Amara folded it and put it inside the satchel, with the divide. The practical work at the lips was complete. The group had cleaned all 3 openings while concentrating correction on west, tested the bowls, listened to the notes, read the depth marks, and restored the intended allocation. What remained was not another adjustment. It was an honest chance for the system downstream to disagree. Amara waited while 3 marked pebbles traveled down 3 separate paths. Nico carried the 1-line marker east toward the terraces. Lila took the 2-line marker along center to the dye beds. Aaron closed his hand around the 3-line marker and followed west toward Mint Bend. Their footsteps separated, then faded beneath water sound and leaves. The afternoon had begun to soften. Light no longer fell straight into the channels. Alder shadows lengthened across the divider slab, making the 3 empty places where the pebbles had rested alternately bright and dim. Amara washed the wooden paddle and laid it to dry. She folded the catchcloth around the removed scale. She checked the 3 lips once with her bare eyes and did not take out the mirror. The east note ran thin. Center answered with its shallow tapping. West held the low, steady tone Aaron had wanted to hear. Then there was nothing to improve. She sat on the bank. Waiting was part of measurement, though it rarely appeared on a tool. The divider might balance for 5 minutes and drift when a loosened grain moved. A branch might look full near the lip and lose water through a cracked side farther down. A garden could receive the expected depth at its inlet while a mat of roots slowed the last reach. The walkers would test those possibilities. Amara's work was to leave the settings alone long enough for their findings to mean something. At first she kept tracing the route each person would take. East would pass the terrace stair, cross the pale mortar, and enter the bean furrows. Center would go beneath the slab bridge, around the madder beds, and reach the square-marked settling pocket. West would pass its first pool, the copper-colored step, the side hollow, and the mint roots. She knew every turn well enough to imagine the water touching it. After a while she stopped imagining. The upper measure fed the divide with its broad hush. An insect landed on the amber bowl and walked around the rim. Amara moved nothing. Warm stone pressed through the cloth at her hip. Somewhere down center, a bird gave 2 short calls. No voice answered. This was quieter work than cleaning, and harder in a different way. If she walked after them, she could see what they saw. If she called instructions, she could protect the final judgment from error. She could also make it hers again. She remembered early seasons when she had carried every marker herself. She would test east, return, test center, return, then go west, keeping 3 strands of evidence in her head. It had seemed efficient because nobody needed to explain an observation to her. Yet the village system did not belong inside one person's head. Channels outlasted knees, eyesight, confidence, and any single keeper's working years. The divide sounded 3 notes under the leaf shadows. Amara waited. Amara waited. Amara waited while 3 marked pebbles returned from 3 separate paths. Each pebble represented an independent downstream flow check. Nico came first from the eastern terraces and placed the 1-line stone on the divider. Depth held at the stair, and the far bean furrow filled to its stop stone. Leela returned from center and set down the 2-line stone. The carved square was met on both faces. The dye-bed soil took an even edge. Aaron emerged last from Mint Bend. He opened his hand and laid the 3-line stone beside the others. The copper step sang, the side hollow filled, and water reached the last mint roots. Amara kept her hands in her lap. 3 markers had gone out under one rule and returned on 3 independent reports. Sound, fixed depth, and garden response agreed from the lips to the tested ends. All 3 reports agreed. The rebalance was complete without another adjustment from Amara. Amaspark, HOX 4E06, H3END. She looked at the row of pebbles. 1 line, 2, 3. None had been left beside a doubtful reach. None had returned in her own pocket. Did anything complicate the reading? She asked. Nico had found 1 bean furrow slow because a clod had fallen from its edge. He had not moved it until he confirmed the main branch level at the stair. Then the gardener beside the plot had broken the clod with a hoe, an ordinary garden correction unrelated to the divide. Leela had seen a dark patch at the far side of the madder bed and checked whether it meant excess. It was shade, not standing water. Aaron had heard a faint ticking below the copper step, and discovered 2 dry reed stems tapping together above the channel. "I removed one," he said, "and then I put it back." Leela raised an eyebrow. "The sound wasn't in the water. It was not mine to correct." Amara smiled. "Good." They did not rush into talk after that. Each had walked alone beside moving water long enough to bring some of the quiet back. Nico sat on the bank and rubbed dust from his ankles. Leela rinsed her fingertips. Aaron untied the mint bundle and chose several stems for the kettle. The practical result now extended through the system. East served the terrace beans to their stopstone. Center met both faces of its carved square and fed the dye beds evenly. West filled its side hollow and reached the last roots at Mint Bend. The source at upper measure remained steady. The cleaned lips held their shares. Amara drew the 3 pebbles toward the shared survey card but did not yet write. "Tell me the check in 1 line each," she said. Nico considered. Movement near the divide matched arrival at the far furrow. Leela said, "Known depth marks agreed with the garden edge." Aaron said, "The branch kept one steady voice from lip to last roots." Those were not the phrases Amara would have chosen. That was precisely why she wanted them. Aaron poured water into the kettle. While it heated, Leela returned the brushes to their canvas pockets. She separated the soft brush they had used so it could dry before being rolled away. Nico collected the comparison leaves and carried them to the dry litter beneath the alder, where they would not re-enter a channel. No one touched the divider settings. The 3 marked pebbles stayed in their row. Their work as traveling questions was finished for the day. Soon they would return to Amara's pocket, but not yet. Against the pale slab, they made the evidence visible. 3 paths taken, 3 independent readings brought home. Amara realized she no longer felt the urge to walk west herself. Mint scent rose as Aaron bruised the leaves between his palms. The kettle began its first quiet murmur. Around them, gardens accepted the restored flow without announcement. Aaron made the tea on the broad downstream corner of the divider, where the stone was level and no cup could fall into a branch without first crossing his knee. He rinsed the pot with a small pour, tipped that water onto the bare gravel, and packed the warmed leaves loosely inside. The rest of the water went over them in a clear stream. He set the lid in place and turned the spout away from everyone passing. "How long?" Nico asked. "Until it smells like enough. A calibrated method. As precise as your leaves." Nico accepted this. They sat in a half circle facing the 3 lips. Nobody occupied the place directly opposite Amara, as if awaiting a lesson. The lesson had become the work behind them, and the work had become water moving out of sight. Amara opened the cedar boards that held the shared survey cards. The top card was thick cream paper ruled by hand. Earlier entries crowded its front: spring clearing, first warm week reading, a note about moss lifted from east, a center bank patch after a burrowing animal disturbed it. Different hands had made the marks. Some letters stood narrow and upright. Others leaned forward. Her own writing was small, compressed, and exact. She turned the card over to the blank lower half of its back. At the top, she wrote the date and the place: 3 Lip Divide. Beneath that, she wrote routine seasonal rebalance. She paused before the next line. Ordinarily, she would have recorded the upper measure level, the 3 gauge values, the finding beneath west, the cleaning method, and the final values. All of that still belonged. But the day had produced methods that could help the next group notice trouble before a gauge arrived. "Nico," she said, "give me your leaf check as an instruction for someone who was not here." He leaned back on his hands and watched the branches. "Choose 2 fallen leaves close in size and shape. Remove unequal stems. Release them at the same moment into neighboring channels with similar runs. Count to a fixed downstream line. Repeat at least 3 times and switch the leaves if you can." Amara wrote, leaving room between clauses. "And what does it prove?" It compares travel over that stretch. It doesn't give volume. A slow leaf can catch an eddy, so one trial proves very little. She added those limits. The tea scent deepened. It mingled with the living mint along the west bank, though the two scents were not quite the same. Leaves in the pot smelled rounder and warmer. Leaves beside the channel smelled green and sharp where water cooled their roots. Leela? Amara asked. Leela described reading fixed depth marks only after checking what kind of mark each one was. Paint, moss, mineral stain, and carved stone did not have equal authority. Paint might fade. Moss might grow upward during a wet month. A stain showed where water had often rested, but not why. A carved mark belonged to an intended setting, yet even that had to be checked against the current season and the downstream garden. Write that last part, she said. A familiar mark is evidence, not an order. Amara wrote it. And the lip? Inspect before reshaping. If pale material sits proud of the stone, test whether it softens. Use a tool softer than the measured edge. Catch what comes away. Stop when the color or texture changes. Amara recorded the warm cloth and soft fiber brush. She noted that no scraper had been needed and no stone had been removed. Beside the note about the quartz grain, she drew a small circle so the next seasonal crew would know where scale was likely to gather again. Aaron poured the tea. He filled Amara's cup last because it stood farthest from the pot, not because of rank. Steam crossed the leaf shadows and disappeared. Your method, Amara said to him. He held the cup under his nose before drinking. Know the ordinary voices first. She waited with the pencil touching the card. East is thin and even at the lip, he continued. Center taps because of the seam below. West is lower. A change in voice tells you where to listen again, not what to fix. Today West caught near the divide but sounded only soft at the copper step. That put the disturbance above the step. And after cleaning, 3 steady notes. Different notes, which matters. If someone tries to make them sound identical, they may unbalance the branches. Amara wrote that too. The card filled with their ways of noticing. Her gauge readings occupied 4 short lines near the bottom. Before, after, accepted summer bands, upper measure steady. For years those numbers might have formed the center of her report. Now they sat among the leaf trials, depth marks, garden responses, and water notes. The brass gauge remained in her satchel, useful and quiet. She passed the card to Nico. Read it for anything I have made clearer than it really was. He took the card in both hands. His lips moved slightly as he followed the lines. At the phrase equal leaf pair, he stopped. Close pair, he said. We never had equal leaves. Amara changed the word. Leela read next. She asked Amara to replace mineral obstruction removed with seasonal mineral scale, softened and brushed from underside of western lip. The first phrase sounded as if they had pulled out a stone blocking the channel. The second preserved the smallness of the discovery. Aaron read last. He tapped the note, 3 branch voices steady. Could say steady at final check, he suggested. Someone reading next month shouldn't think the sound can never change. Amara added the words, no correction stung. Each made the record more faithful. She had asked them to review it, and they had not treated her handwriting as a finished authority. They drank. The tea was light and clean, without sweetness. Warmth from the cups met warmth stored in the stone. Nico stretched his legs toward the east path. Leela sat cross-legged, the brush roll beside her. Aaron cradled his cup in both palms. For a while their talk moved away from the divide. Nico had promised to help reset a bean string before evening. Leela needed to return the borrowed kettle brush to the bakery. Aaron wondered whether the first late figs would be ready by the week's end. None of these matters asked for a decision from Amara. Water continued below them. The center branch caught a seed husk. spun it once and released it. East carried a tiny feather through a band of light. West darkened as the alder shadow crossed its opening, but its low note did not change. Amara turned the survey card sideways and drew 3 small symbols at the margin. A leaf beside Nico's comparison. A short ruled mark beside Leela's depth reading. 3 curved lines beside Erin's listening method. Below them she drew the familiar outline of her folding gauge, one tool among several. She looked at the arrangement. The gauge did not vanish. Its symbol was not smaller than the others. It simply no longer stood alone. We should give the bowl rotation a line, Nico said. Amara handed him the pencil. He hesitated. On the card? There is room. He wrote slowly. Same bowls, same count, change order and hands. Keep only clean runs. His lettering slanted upward. When he finished, he passed the pencil to Leela without being asked. Leela added, compare intended branch marks and downstream need, not equal rims alone. Erin accepted the pencil next. He considered for so long that Nico finished half his tea. Then he wrote, if the 3 readings disagree, wait before changing the stone. The sentence sat at the bottom of the card, plain and spacious. Amara signed the entry with her initials. Then she placed the pencil beside Nico. All of us? He asked. All of us made the reading. Nico signed. Leela signed. Erin made his initials with a flourish too large for the remaining space and had to curl the last stroke beneath the others. The shared card now looked shared. The light shifted another handspan across the divide. The upper surface of the stone began to lose its heat. Along the west bank, mint leaves moved without wind as water pressed softly through their roots. Farther down, someone called once from a garden and received an answer too faint to make out. Leela rose first. She carried her empty cup to the gravel rinse place, poured a small splash through it, and returned the clean cup to Erin. Then she lifted the 2-line pebble from the row. Center belongs back? She asked. The pebble belongs in my pocket, Amara said. The method belongs wherever you carry it. Leela turned the stone over once and placed it in Amara's open hand. Before leaving, she walked to the center lip and crouched without touching. She watched the depth at the second chisel mark. The quick tapping sound continued under the seam. Steady at final check, she said. Then she tied the brush roll, tucked it beneath her arm, and set off along the center path. Her shadow crossed the branch before she did. At the slab bridge she looked back, lifted one hand, and disappeared between the dye beds. The group became 3. Nico gathered the bowls. He nested them with the same folded cloth that had protected them on the way up, but he left the blue bowl out for a moment. He filled it beneath East for one slow count, tipped the water back into the channel, and watched how quickly the last film ran from the glaze. Not a measurement, he said when he noticed Amara watching. What was it? A goodbye to the bowl. A result can be charming and useless. He smiled. This one only needed character. He dried the rim, nested the bowl, and lifted the 1-line pebble. The white mark had picked up a faint smear of damp soil from the terrace path. He rubbed it clean with his thumb before returning it to Amara. Next time, he said, could the leaves compare east and west first? Or should the neighboring runs always be used? Neighboring runs remove some differences in width and shade. But if you repeat enough and record the stretch honestly, east and west can be useful too. And if there are no close leaves, use bowls, use depth, use sound. Or wait for a tree to help. He nodded as though this were a complete and reasonable inventory of choices. At the branch split he turned east. His basket rested easily against his hip, now that the bowls no longer held water. Amara heard his steps across the narrow plank, then the brief rustle of bean leaves as he took the terrace path. The group became 2. Erin poured the last tea evenly between his cup and Amara's. A few softened mint leaves clung to the inside of the pot. He added no more water. They sat without needing to fill the space Leela and Nico had left. Aaron watched the shadows. Amara listened to the divide. The sounds had seemed pronounced during the inspection, each note a piece of evidence. Now they settled back into the place's ordinary presence. Thin east, tapping center. Low west, no note asked to be named. Was it difficult? Aaron asked after a time. The scale, waiting for us to say it was balanced. Amara considered giving him an easy answer. The quiet made that feel wasteful. Yes, she said. Not because I thought you would be careless. Because I know exactly how my own certainty feels, and I do not yet know yours from the inside. Aaron turned his cup between his hands. You knew the readings. I knew what I would conclude from them. Isn't that the same? It has been, often enough. She looked at the signed card. It cannot always be. The 3 independent reports had not become trustworthy merely because they matched her expectation. They were trustworthy because each person had carried a defined question down a different branch, observed a fixed point and a living response, and returned without consulting the others. Their agreement had structure. It was not a chorus trained to repeat her note. Aaron drank the rest of his tea. I nearly came back without the pebble. Amara looked at him. The side hollow took longer to fill than I expected. I thought west was still short. Then I remembered we had arrived earlier in the day last month, when the upstream shade was different. I waded through another little cycle. The hollow filled to the stain and stopped. Why didn't you mention that in the report? I said it filled. The doubt belongs too. He nodded. Amara reopened the card and gave him the pencil. Beneath the west check he added, side hollow appeared late. Held long enough to confirm it reached its usual stain. He put a small dot after the sentence. Better, Amara said. Would you have waited? Yes. Then I borrowed your method. Or learned it. He considered this, then seemed to prefer it. Aaron rinsed the pot and cups on bare gravel. He shook the mint leaves into a little cloth to carry home for compost, rather than dropping them into the channels. The kettle had cooled enough to pack. He wrapped it in its carrying cloth, tied the corners, and stood. Only the 3-line pebble remained on the divider. He picked it up, closed his fingers around it as he had before walking to Mint Bend, and then returned it to Amara. The kettle says west is balanced, he said. Did it boil? No. It listened. He left by the west path. Mint brushed his trouser leg at the bend. For a little while the pale cloth around the kettle remained visible through the alder branches. Then it too was gone. Amara was alone at the divide. The group had dispersed along separate branches for silent checks and reunited over tea. Now they dispersed again toward the rest of their day, carrying no assignment except what they had noticed. Amara put the 3 pebbles into her pocket. They clicked together softly, their white lines hidden. She slid the signed survey card between the cedar boards and tied the cord around them. The board went into her satchel beside the gauge. She made one final round of the immediate workplace. The maintenance paddle was clean and dry. Leela's brushes were gone. No thread, leaf, chop chip, or cloth remained near enough to wash into the channels. The cream scale was folded inside the waistcloth in her bag. The 3 bowls had left with Nico. Aaron's rinse place held only damp gravel. At the western lip she knelt. The clean underside showed as a dark line beneath flowing water. The quartz grain remained as it should. No gate setting had changed. No fresh scratch crossed the measured edge. West passed under the lip, filled the first pull without turning back on itself, and continued toward the copper step and mint bend. She did not unfold the gauge. Instead, she listened once in each of their ways. For Aaron, she heard the 3 notes, east fine and continuous, center lightly tapping, west low and whole. For Leela, she watched the surfaces meet their marks, moss edge, second chisel, dark mineral stripe. For Nico, she followed 3 small leaf shadows rather than leaves. They slid along the channel beds as the alder moved above, each shadow traveling at the pace of the same evening wind, while the water beneath took its separate course. Then she listened in her own way, which was no longer a way she needed to keep apart from theirs. The upper measure remained between its summer lines. The divider lips were clean. The bowls had varied within a narrow range. Leaves had matched over repeated runs. Downstream marks and gardens had confirmed the allocation. 3 pebbles had returned. 4 names stood on the card. Sufficient, she thought. The word did not mean careless or approximate. It meant the evidence had reached the point where more checking would serve her reluctance rather than the water. She closed the satchel. Evening gathered first in the west channel because of the alder. Mint bend beyond it turned green-gray. Center still held a strip of amber sky under the slab bridge. East flashed between terrace stones each time a leaf moved overhead. The sun-warmed divider released its heat slowly beneath Amara's palm. She stayed until the warmth had nearly gone. No one came to ask whether the repair was finished. The gardens already knew in the darkening soil along their furrows. No signal marked the end of the lesson. It rested in a soft brush drying inside Leela's roll, in the possibility that Nico would never again see 2 fallen leaves as merely litter, in Aaron's memory of a low note losing its catch, and in a survey card where the gauge had become 1 symbol among 4. Amara rose and settled the satchel strap on her shoulder. At the path she looked back. The 3 outgoing branches were less visible now than the moving reflections upon them. Their voices remained clear. East held its thin note. Center kept its bright, shallow tapping. West sounded low beneath the mint. 3 steady notes, different and balanced. Leaf shadows lengthened across the pale stone until the marked places where the bowls and pebbles had stood disappeared into shade. Amara left the divide working quietly behind her, its water already well along 3 separate paths.